By 1942, the war in Europe had become a contest of steel and fire. Across the vast battlefields from North Africa to the Eastern Front, tanks ruled the ground. German Panzer divisions had carved through nations with terrifying efficiency. Their machines, Panzer III, Fauer, and later the Tiger, symbolized the unstoppable momentum of blitzkrieg. They struck fast, hit hard, and vanished before their enemies could recover. Allied armies, built on slower doctrine and weaker armor, struggled to find an answer. For the United States, still new to large-scale mechanized warfare, the challenge was immediate. When American troops entered the war, they faced German armor that had already matured through years of combat. The Sherman tank, reliable and easy to produce, was no match for a Tiger or Panther head-on. American commanders needed a solution, not in sheer armor thickness, but in speed and strategy. Thus was born a concept unlike any before: the tank destroyer. This doctrine flipped the traditional idea of armored combat. Instead of meeting tanks in direct duels, these new vehicles would hunt them through mobility and ambush. The U.S. Army envisioned highly agile machines that could race into position, fire, and retreat before the enemy could respond. Protection was secondary. What mattered was striking first and moving faster. At the heart of this philosophy was the belief that no amount of armor could guarantee survival against the devastating power of high-velocity shells. A fast-moving target, however, could evade destruction entirely. It was a bold theory and a dangerous gamble. The first American tank destroyers emerged as hurried adaptations of existing platforms. The M3 gun motor carriage and later the M10 Wolverine offered a glimpse of the idea, but were still too slow to embody it fully. Crews fought courageously, but were limited by designs that couldn't outmaneuver. Training schools across America began reshaping the mindset of armored crews. They were no longer tankers in the traditional sense. They were hunters. They studied German formations, ambush tactics, and terrain advantages. They learned that survival depended on quick calculation and even quicker execution. A single second could decide life or death. By mid-1944, the first M18 Hellcat battalions arrived in Europe. Painted olive drab, their sleek shapes stood out among the heavier Shermans and Priests. Crews were young, often in their early 20s, and eager to test the machine's promise. Some doubted its thin armor. Others were thrilled by its freedom of movement. It could turn faster than any tank, leap across muddy fields, and reach firing positions before German scouts could react. As they rolled toward the front lines in Italy and France, the doctrine met its true test. Would speed alone be enough to survive the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare? The Panzer divisions still held dominance across Europe, their gunners seasoned by years of killing at long range. The Americans were about to find out whether agility could defeat might, and whether fear could change sides on the battlefield. And soon, as those 60-mile-per-hour engines began to roar across Europe, the German Panzer crews would learn to recognize that sound in their bones. The creation of the M18 Hellcat began in the workshops of the Buick Division in early 1943, deep within the industrial heart of America. Engineers there worked under relentless pressure. Every week brought new combat reports from Europe, stories of Sherman tanks destroyed by Panthers at long range, of U.S. units forced into retreat by German armor they could not outgun. The American tank destroyer concept was still controversial, and the Ordnance Department demanded results that could justify its existence. Buick's engineers' approach. When the first units reached the front in Italy, the crews were both excited and uncertain. They had trained hard, but combat was the real test. The Hellcat's open turret gave an unmatched view of the battlefield, but it also left them exposed to artillery, snipers, and even shrapnel from near misses. Rain poured directly inside. In winter, snow gathered in the fighting compartment. Yet crews loved their machines. They gave them nicknames, painted names on their sides, and swore by their engines. The Hellcat was their lifeline, their speed their only armor. As 1944 unfolded, the war in Europe changed. The Allies were pushing inland from the Normandy beaches. The once invincible German armor was stretched thin. retreating under the pressure of overwhelming air power and logistic shortages. Yet their tanks, especially the Panther and Tiger, remained deadly adversaries. A single hit from an 88mm gun could obliterate a Hellcat instantly. Survival meant movement, constant, unpredictable, fearless movement. American doctrine called for tank destroyers to operate independently, supporting infantry by intercepting enemy armor before it could break through. The Hellcats would lie in wait, concealed behind hedgerows or among the ruins of French villages. When German columns appeared, they would strike from the flank, fire once or twice, and vanish before counterfire could find them. Speed replaced armor. Maneuver replaced endurance. Soon, word spread through German ranks. Reports from Panzer battalions described fast American tanks that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The sound of their engines became a psychological weapon. Veterans who had once mocked the lightly armored vehicles began to fear them. They knew that when those engines roared, ambushes followed. The Panzers, once hunters, were now being hunted. Still, the doctrine demanded nerve. Hellcat crews knew that of nerve and a revelation in motion. Its story can only be told through the human eyes that saw it, the tactical minds that directed it, and the technological brilliance that made it possible. For the young Americans who manned the Hellcat, life inside the machine was both exhilarating and terrifying. The interior was cramped, barely enough room for 5 men to operate efficiently. The open turret exposed them to every sound of the battlefield, the whistle of shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, the distant thunder of artillery. They could smell the burning oil and cordite from their own gun after every shot. Yet the openness also gave them vision, a priceless advantage in combat. They could see the landscape in all directions, react instantly to movement, and coordinate faster than crews trapped inside closed steel boxes. Most Hellcat crews were barely out of high school. They were mechanics, farm boys, or factory workers suddenly transformed into hunters of tanks. In training, they learned that hesitation meant death. They drilled endlessly on quick firing, coordinated spotting, and evasive driving. The gunner and driver had to trust each other absolutely. The commander's voice had to be calm, decisive, and fast. When a Hellcat moved, it did so like a living organism, each man a part of its heartbeat. But courage alone was not enough. The Hellcat's true power lay in its doctrine of movement. American commanders understood that they could not out-armor German tanks, but they could outthink them. The Hellcat's tactics relied on ambush and deception. It struck from concealed positions, often waiting silently for hours. When the moment came, the driver would burst forward, the gunner already locked on target, the first shell leaving the barrel before the enemy realized what was happening. Then, before retaliation could arrive, the Hellcat was gone, retreating to cover, or circling around for another strike. This tactic turned the battlefield into a deadly dance. The German tankers, trained for direct confrontations, found themselves frustrated by an enemy they could rarely hit. Hellcats appeared at unexpected angles, using their superior speed to flank slower panzers. On roads and open terrain, they could cross distances in seconds that took heavier tanks minutes. In the chaos of battle, that difference meant everything. The technological achievement behind this agility was remarkable. The Hellcat's torsion bar suspension system allowed smooth travel at high speed across uneven terrain. Its engine, a Wright R975 radial, originally designed for aircraft, produced nearly 400 horsepower, propelling the 20-ton vehicle to speeds unmatched by any tank in the world. Its gun, though lighter than a Tiger's, could destroy German armor from the side or rear with deadly precision. Crews learned to aim for weak points, lower hulls, turret rings, or exposed tracks. 1 or 2 well-placed rounds could cripple even the most formidable opponent. Every piece of the machine was designed for motion. The transmission allowed quick shifts between forward and reverse, enabling instant retreats after firing. The lightweight construction meant it could cross bridges that heavier tanks could not. It could be loaded onto transport ships more easily, and deployed rapidly to new fronts. Where panzers lumbered, the Hellcat flew, yet that speed came at a price. Its armor was paper-thin by comparison. A single hit from an enemy shell could ignite its fuel or ammunition. Crews knew that if they were caught in the open, survival was unlikely. This reality shaped their mentality. They fought with an understanding that every movement counted. The Hellcat demanded precision, not just in engineering, but in human coordination. American tank destroyer battalions quickly learned to integrate with infantry and artillery units. Their job was to cover advancing troops, intercept counterattacks, and protect supply lines from armored thrusts. Communication was vital. Radio coordination allowed Hellcats to strike from multiple angles at once, overwhelming even superior German formations. Their presence boosted morale among infantrymen who had once felt helpless against enemy tanks. In many ways, the Hellcat was a symbol of the American approach to war. Innovative, mobile, and unorthodox. It rejected brute strength for adaptability. It showed that speed, intelligence, and timing could defeat even the heaviest armor. German crews soon began describing their encounters in anxious tones. Reports mentioned small, open vehicles that move like lightning, and American tanks that strike from nowhere. That fear was not only psychological, it reflected a fundamental shift in warfare. The Hellcat blurred the line between armor and strategy. It forced both sides to think differently about the battlefield. The Germans could no longer assume that their superior guns and armor would dominate. The Americans, meanwhile, gained confidence that they could match and defeat the feared panzer divisions through precision and audacity. To the men inside the Hellcat, every mission was a gamble between life and annihilation. But they trusted the speed beneath them and the comrades beside them. They learned that survival was not about being the strongest. It was about being the fastest to act, the quickest to decide, and the first to strike. And soon, this philosophy would be tested against Germany's best armored divisions, where every mile per hour of speed and every heartbeat of courage would determine the outcome. For the Germans, the arrival of the M18 Hellcat was deeply unsettling. Panzer crews were used to dictating the rhythm of battle. Their tanks, with thick armor and high-velocity guns, had dominated Europe since 1939. But by late 1944, the familiar rules no longer applied. Reports began filtering through the ranks about small, fast American vehicles that could strike and vanish before the panzers could even aim. These were not lumbering tanks. They were hunters that refused to stand still. German tank commanders soon realized they were facing a new kind of enemy. In engagements across France, their armored columns were repeatedly flanked by units that appeared out of nowhere. They would hear engines screaming through the trees, then shells slamming into their sides or rear armor. By the time they turned their turrets, the attackers were gone. Prisoner interrogations later revealed what they had faced. The Hellcat. To many panzer men, the experience was terrifying. They described the attacks as being ambushed by ghosts. The psychological impact was immense. Panzer crews had been trained to dominate through fear and firepower. But now, they were reacting to fear themselves. The sound of a Hellcat's engine, high-pitched and fast, could trigger panic in even experienced soldiers. Some German reports described tankers abandoning vehicles after repeated flank strikes, convinced that more Hellcats were closing in. This fear wasn't just the product of legend. It was a rational reaction to a machine that changed the pace of armored warfare. From the American perspective, the moral equation was complex. Hellcat crews knew their advantage was speed, but they also knew how vulnerable they were. A single hit could tear their thin armor apart, leaving no survivors. They fought with the constant awareness that they were operating on borrowed time. Many veterans later recalled the strange duality of confidence and terror, the exhilaration of speed, and the ever-present fear of death. Some compared it to flying a fighter plane with no wings. There was also the moral tension between technological brilliance and human fragility. The M18's design philosophy valued agility over protection, meaning it deliberately placed its crew at greater risk. Each battle forced commanders to weigh speed against safety. Was it right to send men into combat in machines that could not withstand direct fire? The Hellcat embodied the harsh logic of total war, where necessity often overruled morality. On the battlefield, this balance between bravery and fragility defined every engagement. The open turret allowed clear visibility, but also exposed the crew to shrapnel and snipers. In winter, they froze. In summer, they baked under the sun. Yet they refused to trade their speed for armor. Better to move fast than die slow, one veteran later said. That belief became the unofficial creed of the Hellcat units. The impact of the Hellcat extended beyond individual battles. It reshaped Allied tactics as a whole. Tank destroyer battalions were increasingly integrated into larger mechanized forces, providing rapid response and counterattack capability. Their ability to maneuver quickly made them invaluable during both offensive and defensive operations. In the hedgerows of Normandy, they cleared paths for infantry. In the open plains of France, they struck at retreating columns. During the push toward Germany, they became the fast-moving spearheads of exploitation forces, capturing bridges and road junctions before the enemy could react. German strategists, too, were forced to adapt. The once aggressive Panzer formations became cautious, avoiding open terrain and relying more heavily on defensive positions. But this shift came too late. The Hellcat's philosophy had already proven its worth. It turned mobility into dominance. Where the Germans relied on armor, the Americans relied on timing. Technologically, the Hellcat represented a critical transition in armored warfare. It foreshadowed a future where speed, fire control, and maneuver would outweigh sheer mass. Its lessons would echo in post-war designs like the M41 Walker Bulldog and even the early prototypes of the M60 series. Engineers realized that agility not only saved lives, but could win battles outright. The Hellcat had proven that armor was not the only path to victory. On a human level, the bond between crew and machine was profound. The Hellcat was unforgiving. It rewarded skill and punished mistakes instantly. Crews developed an almost personal relationship with their vehicles, naming them, maintaining them meticulously, and treating them as living companions. Each engine sound, each vibration through the hull, became familiar. When something changed, they knew it instinctively. That connection made them faster, more responsive, and more lethal. The German soldiers who faced them often misunderstood the nature of their enemy. They assumed the Hellcats were tanks, not realizing they were part of a separate tactical philosophy. This misunderstanding worked to the Americans' advantage. German units wasted precious time engaging Hellcats as if they were Shermans, exposing their sides to other attacks in the process. Speed wasn't just physical. It was psychological. By late 1944, the Hellcat had become a legend on both sides of the front. American troops admired it as a miracle of engineering. German tankers dreaded it as an omen of sudden disaster. Its 60-mile-per-hour roar echoed through forests, towns, and valleys, a reminder that no fortress of steel could withstand momentum driven by intelligence and courage. But legends are tested in fire. The Hellcat's true legacy would not be decided by doctrine or design, but by combat. In the fields of Lorraine, the hills of Alsace, and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Hellcat would meet the best of Germany's armored might head-on. There, amid smoke, mud, and chaos, its creed of speed and precision would be put to the ultimate test. And the world would learn whether velocity could defeat invincibility. The morning of September 19, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the rolling hills near Arracourt, France. A blanket of fog covered the fields, muffling sound and hiding movement. Beneath that, mist, one of the most dramatic armored clashes of the Western Front was about to unfold. The German 11th Panzer Division had been ordered to strike hard and fast, to reclaim ground lost to Patton's advancing Third Army. Their confidence rested on their tanks, Panthers and Panzer IVs, machines that had proven their worth against every Allied foe. But what they didn't know was that waiting for them, scattered across the fields and hedgerows, were the American M18 Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The Germans attacked in strength, pushing through the fog in tight formation. Their commanders believed surprise was on their side. For the first few hours, it seemed so. Sherman's and infantry units fell back under heavy shelling. The battlefield turned into chaos. Communication lines broke down, and visibility was nearly zero. But among that confusion, the Hellcat crews began to move. They had trained for this. Hit fast, hit hard, vanish. Major Charles B. Gates, commanding the 704th, ordered his men to hold their fire until the panzers were close. The fog that concealed the Germans also protected the Americans. Engines idled quietly behind hedges. Gunners squinted through mist-covered sights, fingers resting on triggers. Then, through the haze, the outlines of Panthers emerged, massive, slow-moving shapes unaware that death was waiting just a few hundred yards away. The first shot came from Sergeant Joseph Cicchetti's Hellcat. A single round struck a Panther's side armor, igniting its fuel. Flames erupted, and before the Germans could react, the rest of the battalion opened fire. Dozens of muzzle flashes lit the fog like lightning. Hellcats roared into motion, repositioning constantly. Their engines screamed at full throttle, moving faster than the Panthers could traverse their turrets. In less than 10 minutes, the ambush shattered the lead elements of the German assault. The Germans were stunned. Their formation broke apart as Panthers tried to face an enemy they could barely see. Hellcats, meanwhile, used every second of confusion to attack from multiple angles. Drivers pushed their machines to the limit, darting across fields, circling around flanks, firing and retreating. Each move was calculated, each shot deliberate. The thin armor of the Hellcats offered no protection if they were hit, but their speed made them nearly untouchable. By noon, the fog began to lift. The battlefield revealed a grim sight, burning panzers scattered across the fields, their black smoke curling into the sky. The Americans, vastly outnumbered, had held their ground. The German 11th Panzer Division had expected to crush a single American unit. Instead, they had walked into a storm of precision and speed. For 2 more days, the battle raged. German reinforcements arrived, bringing even more tanks into the fight. The Americans countered not with mass, but with mobility. Hellcats would appear suddenly on one flank, strike hard, and vanish before German gunners could respond. They moved between defensive positions like ghosts, guided by radio coordination and instinct. At one point, a German column advanced through an open valley, believing the way clear. In reality, Hellcats were hidden along both ridges. As the panzers entered, they were hit from both sides. The valley turned into a killing ground. When the smoke cleared, the wreckage of 25 German tanks lay burning, victims of an enemy that never stayed still. The Battle of Arracourt became a masterpiece of American armored tactics. The 704th, working alongside the 4th Armored Division, destroyed over 80 German tanks in less than a week, while losing only a fraction of their own. The victory stunned both sides. German intelligence could not understand how lightly armored vehicles had outmaneuvered and destroyed some of their best tanks. The answer was simple: speed, coordination, and courage. For the Hellcat crews, it was vindication. Their doctrine, once ridiculed by some Allied officers as reckless, had proven itself in the crucible of battle. They had shown that fast-moving, lightly armored tank destroyers could not only survive, but dominate against superior machines. The experience transformed them from students of theory into masters of the battlefield. But it came at a cost. Many crews never returned from their missions. The open turret that allowed them to see better also made them vulnerable to artillery and airbursts. Some were caught during repositioning. their vehicles engulfed in fire within seconds. Survivors later spoke of the smell of burning rubber, the deafening roar of the engines, and the relentless adrenaline that left their hands shaking long after the fighting ended. To the Germans, Arracourt was a shock. Their tanks had been built for strength, not speed. Their doctrine relied on overpowering the enemy head-on. Against the Hellcat, that philosophy failed. The Americans had turned mobility into lethality. As the smoke cleared and silence returned to the French countryside, the legend of the Hellcat spread across the front lines. Word reached every unit. There were new hunters in the fields of Europe, and the Panzer crews, once the predators of armored warfare, began to realize that the sound of those roaring engines meant something dreadful was coming. But the test of Arracourt was only the beginning. Greater challenges awaited in the winter ahead, when the frozen forests of the Ardennes would again echo with the engines of war. By December 1944, the war in Europe had reached a critical point. The Allies had pushed deep into France and Belgium, confident that Germany was nearing collapse. But the German High Command had one final gamble to play: a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The plan was bold: split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. What began on December 16th would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack caught the Allies off guard. Entire divisions were thrown into confusion as waves of German tanks and infantry poured through the snow-covered forests. The roads were choked with retreating vehicles, civilians, and wounded soldiers. Amid the chaos, one thing became clear: the Americans needed speed. They needed units that could move quickly across icy terrain, strike hard, and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Once again, the Hellcats were called into action. The 705th and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions were rushed into the fight, their engines roaring through the freezing air. Temperatures dropped below zero, but the crews pressed on, faces wrapped in scarves, hands stiff from the cold. Snow and ice covered their open turrets, and wind bit through their uniforms. Yet the Hellcats didn't slow down. Even in the harshest winter of the war, their engines screamed at 60 miles per hour, the sound echoing across the white forests of Belgium. Outside Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded, the Hellcats played a decisive role. They raced through enemy lines, striking German armor that tried to close the ring. In narrow roads and forest paths, their agility gave them a critical edge. Panthers and Tigers struggled to maneuver in the deep snow, while the lighter Hellcats weaved through drifts and ambushed from hidden clearings. The contrast was stark: one side heavy, methodical, and powerful; the other swift, elusive, and deadly. On December 19th, near the village of Noville, a group of Hellcats from the 705th encountered advancing German tanks. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, they chose not to retreat. Instead, they used the terrain, firing from behind low hills, reversing immediately after each shot. Snow and smoke blended together, creating a confusing storm for the Germans. Within minutes, several Panzers were disabled. The rest hesitated, fearing another ambush. That moment of hesitation gave the Americans time to regroup and reinforce the line. Elsewhere, Hellcats served as mobile fire brigades, racing from one endangered sector to another. Their speed allowed them to respond faster than any other armored unit. In the maze of forest roads, they appeared unexpectedly, striking columns that thought the area clear. They attacked supply convoys, disabled command vehicles, and vanished before German counterfire could land. These hit-and-run tactics became nightmares for German logistics officers trying to maintain momentum. But the conditions were brutal. The open-topped design that once provided visibility now exposed crews to snow, wind, and artillery shrapnel. Frostbite was common. Some men wrapped blankets around themselves while operating the gun, their breath freezing in the air. Yet morale stayed high. The crews took pride in being the fastest thing on the battlefield. They joked that their engines ran hotter than they did, and that the cold couldn't catch them any more than the Germans could. The fighting reached its peak around Christmas. German units closed in on Bastogne, determined to crush the isolated 101st Airborne. But the defenders held, bolstered by the relentless work of the tank destroyer battalions. Hellcats patrolled the outskirts, engaging enemy armor and preventing breakthroughs. Their speed allowed them to plug gaps wherever the line wavered. Each day, they delayed the German timetable, denying them the quick victory they needed. When Patton's Third Army finally broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26, many of the Hellcat crews had been fighting without rest for more than a week. Their machines were battered, paint scarred, tracks worn thin, but their spirit was unbroken. They had held the line, not through armor or numbers, but through sheer mobility and determination. For the Germans, the Ardennes offensive marked the end of their armored dominance. The terrain, weather, and Allied resilience combined to destroy their last reserves of strength. Their vaunted Tiger and Panther tanks were now symbols of frustration. Too heavy for the snow, too slow for the fight. The Hellcats had proven that speed could triumph even in the most unforgiving conditions. After the Bulge, the Allied advance resumed. The Hellcats continued their relentless pursuit across the Rhine, cutting off retreating German units and striking at convoys trying to escape eastward. Their tactics evolved into a form of mechanized guerrilla warfare, swift raids, sudden ambushes, and rapid redeployments. Every time German crews heard that familiar roar, they braced for attack. The once proud Panzer divisions were now on the defensive, reacting rather than commanding. In those final months, the Hellcat became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. It embodied the shift from static warfare to mobility-driven combat. Even as the war neared its end, the crews knew they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of armored doctrine, one built on speed, communication, and adaptability rather than mass and armor. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, many Hellcat battalions were still on the move, patrolling empty roads through shattered towns. Their machines, coated with dust and scars, stood as silent witnesses to a war that had tested every limit of courage and invention. And for the German tankers who survived, the memory of those engines never faded. Even decades later, veterans recalled the distinctive sound of the M18, high, fierce, and fast. A sound that meant danger was coming, and that even the thickest armor might not save them. The roar of the Hellcat had become more than a noise. It was the sound of a new age in warfare. The war in Europe was nearing its close, but the legacy of the Hellcat and the American tank destroyer force was only beginning to unfold. By April 1945, German resistance had splintered into isolated pockets, their armored divisions shattered beyond repair. The once dreaded Panzers were now rusting wrecks along roadsides or abandoned in villages the Americans had passed through days earlier. Yet, in these final weeks, the men of the tank destroyer battalions continued their relentless pursuit, driving deep into the heart of Germany. Reports from the front told of M18s cutting off retreating convoys, seizing bridges before demolition teams could destroy them, and pushing ahead of infantry columns to scout enemy movement. For the crews, every mission felt like the end of a long, brutal journey. Many had fought from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. They had watched friends fall beside them, their open turrets leaving them exposed to every shell fragment and sniper's bullet. Yet they pressed on, not because of orders alone, but because they believed in finishing what they had start. And at this stage, German morale had collapsed. Fuel shortages crippled tank movement, and the Luftwaffe's presence was virtually non-existent. American columns roamed freely, their coordination made possible by superior logistics and communication networks. For the M18 Hellcats, this was their natural environment: open terrain, clear roads, and the freedom to move. Their engines thundered across fields and villages, engines whining at high speed as they raced toward objectives far ahead of schedule. German prisoners often spoke with disbelief about the speed of the American advance. Some described watching Hellcats appear on the horizon, firing and disappearing before their commanders could react. Others recounted ambushes where their columns were torn apart by vehicles moving so fast they seemed like phantoms. For those who had survived the chaos of Arracourt or the terror of Bastogne, the sight or even the sound of those tank destroyers was enough to bring back dread. But the aftermath was not without reflection. As victory came closer, military planners began to assess what the tank destroyer force had truly achieved. The concept had been controversial from the beginning. Some argued that lighter, faster guns were the future of armored warfare, while others insisted that only heavily armored tanks could survive modern battlefields. The performance of the M18 challenged both ideas. It proved that agility and precision could overcome brute strength when used intelligently. Yet, it also revealed the limits of such a design. Many Hellcats had been lost in close engagements where their thin armor could not withstand return fire. Their open turrets had cost countless lives. Crews learned to depend on speed and cunning, not protection. Theirs was a war of seconds, hit first or be destroyed. This harsh truth became evident in the statistics. While Hellcat units recorded some of the highest kill ratios of any American armored force, they also suffered heavy crew casualties. The success came at a human price. When the war ended in May 1945, many surviving tank destroyer crews gathered to reflect on what they had endured. They were proud, but weary. For them, the end felt strange. There were no grand parades on the front lines, only silence, smoke, and the realization that the constant roar of engines was finally gone. Some walked up to their battered machines, running hands across scorched armor plates that had carried them through Europe. The Hellcat had been more than a vehicle. It had been their shield, their companion, and at times, their coffin. In towns liberated by their advance, civilians greeted the crews as heroes. Children climbed onto their tanks, smiling for photographs that would later become part of history's archives. But for the men inside those photos, each smile carried memories of noise, fear, and loss. The aftermath of victory was not celebration. It was reflection. And as Europe began to rebuild from the ruins, the sound of the Hellcat faded into the distance, replaced by silence and the questions that every veteran would carry for the rest of his life. In the months following Germany's surrender, the American tank destroyer battalions began to stand down. What had started as an experiment in mobile anti-tank warfare had become one of the most striking success stories of the U.S. Army's armored doctrine. Yet, even as the guns fell silent, debates raged in military circles about the future of the tank destroyer concept. The Hellcat's achievements were undeniable. Across Europe, from Normandy to the Rhine, the M18 had destroyed hundreds of German tanks and armored vehicles. Its top speed of 60 miles per hour, unheard of for a tracked vehicle of its class, had changed how commanders thought about mobility. But its very design, light armor, open turret, and reliance on speed, was also its weakness. Against heavy tanks like the Tiger or Panther, success depended entirely on maneuvering and surprise. The crews knew this. Every time they engaged the enemy, they understood the odds. After the war, the U.S. Army's assessment of tank destroyer operations was both proud and pragmatic. Reports praised the courage and discipline of the battalions, the efficiency of their tactics, and their contributions in key battles such as Arracourt, Bastogne, and the Ruhr. But the same reports also concluded that the traditional tank destroyer as a separate class of vehicle had outlived its purpose. Future wars, planners believed, would require more versatile, heavily armed tanks capable of both offense and defense, a philosophy that would eventually lead to the creation of the main battle tank. For the Hellcat crews, this evolution was bittersweet. Many had risked their lives proving that speed could triumph over armor, only to see their beloved machines declared obsolete. But they also knew they had changed warfare forever. The principles born on the muddy fields of France and the frozen roads of Belgium would shape armored doctrine for generations. The idea that mobility, coordination, and superior communication could defeat even the most powerful tanks, became the foundation of modern mechanized warfare. As the soldiers returned home, they carried with them stories that were both heroic and haunting. Some spoke of the exhilaration of racing through enemy lines, the adrenaline of outflanking a Panther at full speed. Others remembered the silence after a battle, when only smoke and burning metal remained. Many could still hear the roar of their engines at night, a sound that had once meant life, and now echoed only in memory. The Hellcat itself found new life in peacetime. Several units were sold or transferred to Allied nations, including Yugoslavia and Taiwan, where they continued to serve for decades. Others were scrapped or left to rust in depots across Europe. A few found their way into museums and veterans' parades, polished and restored, standing as reminders of a time when speed and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. In the United States, veterans formed associations to preserve the history of their battalions. They met at reunions, shared old photographs, and told stories to younger generations who had never known war. At those gatherings, one topic always returned: the sound. The high-pitched whine of the M18's engine, distinct and unforgettable. Many joked that if they ever heard it again, they'd duck for cover out of instinct. Historians later described the M18 Hellcat as a paradox, a machine that was both fragile and fearless. It was under-armored yet overperforming, lightly built yet heavily impactful. It was never meant to be invincible. It was meant to be fast, decisive, and unpredictable. In that sense, it achieved exactly what it was designed to do. By the time the last Hellcats were retired from active service, their legend had already taken root in the annals of armored warfare. The Panzer crews who once feared them spoke of their encounters with respect. To them, the Hellcat was not just a machine. It was a ghost that struck fast, vanished, and left wreckage behind. And as the world moved into the nuclear age, the lessons of the Hellcat remained quietly embedded in every military strategist's mind. Speed is power, surprise is survival, and sometimes, the sound of a racing engine can change the course of history. The story of the Hellcat is not merely about a machine. It is about the men who drove it, the fear it inspired, and the change it brought to the art of war. In a world consumed by the weight of armor and firepower, the Hellcat dared to prove that agility, courage, and innovation could rewrite the rules of battle. Its crews were not protected by thick steel or towering guns. They were protected by instinct, teamwork, and a shared understanding that survival depended on outthinking the enemy. They learned to see battle differently, not as a contest of brute force, but as a test of speed, precision, and nerve. When historians speak of the Hellcat's legacy, they often speak of its numbers and victories. But behind those figures were men who gambled their lives every time they pressed the accelerator, knowing one mistake could end everything. In the silence that followed the war, those engines stopped, but their echoes remained. The Hellcat represented a new kind of courage, the courage to fight without overwhelming protection, to trust movement over armor, and to face the most powerful tanks of the war with nothing but speed and willpower. Its influence outlived its era. Modern armored doctrine still carries its imprint. Strike fast, stay mobile, and never give the enemy a chance to aim. The Hellcat showed that in warfare, as in life, survival often belongs to those who adapt the fastest. For the German Panzer crews, the sound of those roaring engines became an omen of defeat, a sound that signaled not just the arrival of an enemy, but the arrival of change. The battlefield was no longer ruled by weight and armor alone. And for the men who drove the M18 into the heart of Europe, it was more than just war. It was proof that even in the darkest hours, human ingenuity could find a way forward. Swift, relentless, unstoppable. The roar of the Hellcat faded long ago, but its spirit endures. In every soldier who values speed over fear, and every commander who believes that intelligence can triumph over strength, the Hellcat still runs, fast as ever, through the pages of history.